I am NetMoverSitan. Yes, I know this one's a short one, but the next one will have a pretty lengthy breakdown of the law. Trust me, it'll be quite a bit to go through. So that's why I'm making this a short one. Next we have the Wedge Office, the sister office of the Dawn Office, the only survivor of which was Philip. The fixers of this office look like something straight out of Bloodborne. They even have the aggressive combat prowess to match. They're typically armed with huge spears or lances, perfect for going Vlad the Impaler on their targets. There was an understanding between the Dawn and Wedge fixer officers. Each would come to the aid of the other when they needed it. Apparently they had a similar overall focus, but different methodologies. As for those who are a part of this fixer office, first we have Oscar. This eye patch wearing operator is one that suffers no delusions regarding how he deals with other fixers, or with his targets. He gives advice to those that need it, when he sees it as necessary, and he understands the necessity of piercing strikes based on precision assessment. Possibly Seven Association affiliated? Either that or She Association. Although he might find it difficult to predict an opponent that has an erratic pattern to it. He has at least enough concern for his fixers to be willing to retrieve the head of one of them in a stasis preservation casket. Yeah, that's U-Court tech. To replace it with a cloned body. Due to insurance, that's actually useful for once. Although one thing that he was nervous about, more than his enemy, it was Moses of Moses' office, the distortion detective. Now, I'll need to cover that side story at some point, as it's something that ties into this, where it involves one investigating the distortion phenomenon. As for Oscar, he was a good friend of Salvador's. They've known each other for a while, although it's unclear if it was during the Smoke War. As for his eye patch, it's unclear if it's some kind of cybernetic replacement or he covers it up as he doesn't want one, even though he could presumably afford one. Next we have Pamela, one of the fixers of the Wedge Office. She's blunt with her speech and says things like it is, but isn't the least considerate of the fixers of her office. Their office, at least as far as she's concerned, are for those looking for a precise situational assessment rather than combat prowess, to come up with a number of scenarios and take the most of the enemy as possible with the least amount of effort. They are hunters. They treat their targets like a wild boar and stab it with pointy sticks in the areas that most affects them. They're in a partnership with other officers to help them deal with specific requests that they're not able to deal with by themselves, or at least just for reinforcements. In the case of the Dawn office, they specialize in combat, while the Wedge office analyzes what an opponent is weakest against, so that they know what they are up against. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if the Wedge office was affiliated with Seven Association, as this would sound like something they do. Based on that, well, whatever the case, they go well together. Next we have Pamela. Now, she looks similar to Pamela, and it might look like they're twin sisters, but there's a reason for that. They act similar to each other, being as blunt in speech as the other, although Pamela was torn apart in one of her more recent assignments. Thankfully, her head was retrieved, and even more thankfully, she had insurance that covered her for a cloned body, which must have surprised her, as usually life insurance was considered pointless. Once the money was given, they don't give it back. And as for ensuring the damage sustained, she considered it better to save up for something that actually increased chances of survival, such as an augmentation procedure or good quality workshop gear. As apparently, there's a lottery in the city and you're more likely to win it than to have the insurance cover the damage. And that's not considering how much that comes out of her pay. Yeah, she's much more blunt towards others than Pamela is, and is also more inconsiderate towards them. Finally, we have Philip. That's right, he's back! He's come to request the aid of the Wedge Office after Gramps and Xianbi, or Salvador and Yuna, were killed in the library, and he ran off unable to fight to the death. This is a continuation of his story from the Dawn office. Well, we'll see how this one goes soon enough. The story continues at the Wedge office. Philip had turned up and Pamela was telling him to help himself to food, as he was going to starve to death if he didn't. I don't think he's in the mood to eat at that point, as two of those he cared about have just been turned into books. He certainly doesn't feel like it, at least according to him. Pamela either wasn't aware of this emotional torment or she just didn't care, as she basically told him to harden his heart. If he did, his office wouldn't have been wiped out, implying that she believed that it was all his fault, not thinking that he would have been killed as well if he didn't run off to tell them about it. Then Pamela asked if he thought that it was his fault that Salvador and Yuna were no longer there. He seemed to think so. He believed that if he'd been stronger and more mature, they'd still be around, had he stayed and not ran away when he was about to be killed. If he did that, he wouldn't have been able to warn them about the library. As for what Pamela had to think about that, well, she was unsympathetic and agreed with him. Great going. Why not just stick your pointy weapons through his flaccid innards and put him out of his misery, you insensitive... A word has yet to be invented to describe her. Pamela believed that he was too daft and weak to keep others safe, that it was all his fault that everyone died. I don't think so. If he stayed behind, he'd have been killed too. So by Fixer standards, he's actually quite typical, willing to leave them behind and not care about them if it meant his own survival. Then she asked if he felt better and told him to think what he wanted. Whoa, passive-aggressive, aren't you? Then she spoke as if she knew him, when she said that when something happens, he makes up reasons that were convenient to him, otherwise known as believing what he wanted, because it's convenient to distance himself from any accountability. How is your office still around with that attitude? Apparently he doesn't care about what he's doing. He just wants to believe that he does. Then again, she does have some points. And then Oscar, their operator, basically told them that was enough, even though Pamela complained that it was all Pamela. Oscar then asked Philip if he was feeling well enough to talk. Philip thanked him for their kindness. Well, they are sister offices, so they have to help each other out. As for where the Wedge office was during the Dawn office's ill-fated expedition into the library, they were taking care of a case of the distortion in District 12. Yeah, the same district that the library is. The same district that there's a gang war between the Thumb and the Index. This one was called the 8 o'clock Circus, where those victimized by them were driven insane and lacking in any inhibitions, where he described it as a festival in hell. So quite bad, even by the city standards. They mostly dealt with the monstrosities that were sent to fight them. Unfortunately, Pamela was bitten by a warped human in the form of a lion, which made her explode. Thankfully, she had her body replaced. And no, it wasn't a robotic body, as a robotic body that could pass for human, that would violate the AI Ethics Amendment. So, why does she look human if her body was replaced? Well, the reason for that it was cloned. Yeah. There's technology that can allow for cloning a replacement body, although considering how similar her new body was to Pamela's, the genetic material was likely from Pamela. Well, Pamela was annoyed by Pamela's ingratitude, first telling her not to damage that body on purpose, and then, in frustration, told her to die in a way that makes her stay dead, so that she wouldn't have to pay Pamela back for the cloned body. Well, that implied a couple of things. One, the insurance didn't cover all of the cost. And two, it's possible that the cloned body used Pamela's genetic material. Now, this irritated Pamela, asking if Pamela wanted a fight. Pamela confirmed this. Thankfully, Oscar stopped them before this started, but not through some more, how can I put it, direct intervention. Oh no. It was due to something else entirely. It was due to something more unrelated. Can you guess what that was? Well, if you've been following through with the main story, you'll know, but I'll tell you in this because, well, it's kind of the point, isn't it? It's because he commended Philip on his making of sangria cha. Apparently he's been keeping in touch with Salvador. Then Philip continued to bootlick Oscar by thanking him. Then Oscar asked Philip if the library appeared to be related to the distortion phenomenon in any way. Well, we know it's connected. As for Philip, he's not so sure, as he's not fought against the distortion yet. But it was unfamiliar to him in every way. It was also where Salvador and Una became books. Yeah, not particularly helpful to Oscar, but it was certainly worth asking. More than one association had been dealing with the library, along with the wings and even the fingers. Were struggling to figure it out. Philip didn't see this as important, as Oscar observed that Philip just wanted to head back into the library to retrieve their books. Philip confirmed this, but Salvador told him in a note before he left the library that he shouldn't rush into the situation and instead depend on their aid. Oscar considered Philip to be troublesome, even when thinking about his old friend, one who had left behind a widow and, wait, he had children? Well, death is a risk that catches up to them all in the end. Philip hadn't met them, as he was too ashamed to face them. Oscar then told him to ready his gear as they were heading to the library. Philip thanked him. This wasn't to be confused for kindness, as Oscar was going there anyway. He also sees himself as bearing responsibility for Salvador's death. He also didn't consider Philip to be Wedge Office material, seeing him as below his personal standards. Philip was concerned if it was so wrong and pathetic to repay the favours of his colleagues for their sake, where acting on attachment was considered unclassy and naive. He angrily questioned why the people living in that city can't do anything on behalf of others. Primarily considered Philip insufferable, as Oscar didn't say that he was wrong. He just didn't want fixers like Philip in their office, because he's seen as unreliable because he's easily swayed by his feelings. Oh, so that's why you're such an insensitive hole. She asks if he wants them all to die to fulfill his ideals. Oscar then questioned whether Philip believed that He's sincerely doing things for others, believing himself to be different from the selfish, devoid of compassion in that city. Believing that he's doing things for a higher cause, or another way of putting it is the greater good. Oscar sees it for what it is. A bad joke that was bombed more than the city of Stalingrad during World War II, now called Volgograd. As these were selfish thoughts with an appearance of selflessness. He sees this as Philip deceiving himself, basically to distance himself from the guilt that he's feeling. He believes that there's no such thing as a selfless action for humans, where even the act of self-sacrifice is ultimately for oneself. Now that I have dispute with, as sacrifice means giving up what is valuable, not what is worthless. And to many in that city, life was worthless, as many seem to desire their own death, even if they aren't aware of it. Selfless actions are those that benefit others and not yourself, an attitude that had become rare in that city. As for Philip's self-deception, it would slowly eat away at others and lead to their destruction. When Philip struggled to answer, Oscar questioned if it was truly for the sake of Salvador and Una. He then decided to get ready for the library. Yeah, clearly a sensitive subject. After watching this, Roland saw that Philip was hurt, but he agreed with Oscar that Philip was deceiving himself into disguising selfishness as a selfless act. Angela understood this, seeing the determination to work for the good of others as a dreadful and loathsome weapon, especially if one strongly believed that the justice that they were pursuing was worth sacrificing for. Blinded by self-righteousness with no regard for what others had to deal with, justifying themselves, pressing forward, all to pursue this justice, letting nothing stand in their way. Perhaps you need to review what you just said, Angela. You were never taught about compassion and caring for others, well, other than yourself, so are you in any better position to lecture anyone about this at this point? Well, at least you don't hide your plans behind self-deceit. Well, you're certainly more honest about them. Roland was amazed with how he understood her position. Angela then offered him champagne. Yeah, that alcoholic beverage invented by the monk Dom Pignon around the time of Louis XIV. Yeah, surprising that Angela was offering him alcohol. When the Wedge Office and Philip entered the library, Pamela told Philip to stop frowning as this annoyed her. Pamela was more considerate, telling Pamela to give him some space. But Pamela was more concerned about her own emotional well-being. Philip told them to not care about him, and he'll try not to be a hindrance. Oscar would have stabbed him if he was sure that he would be. Ooh, then why bring him along in the first place? Then Angela appeared to greet them, noting that they were in an ill mood. Oscar was confused by Angela. He believed her to be a machine, but she appeared partially human. They determined that by, as Pamela put it, by poking her to make sure. This made Angela stare viciously to express her displeasure at their rudeness. Pamela thought that Angela was supposed to be nice. Well, she is when her guests aren't trying to be violent towards her, or by being. Angela explained that she was advised that she could skip the courtesy with ill-mannered guests who were generally unpleasant to her for no reason. Oscar told her that they couldn't afford to be polite when their lives were at risk. And this offended Angela enough so that she left without giving her default greeting, which deviated from Pamela's expectations. That would have something to do with poking her with your large spears and mentioning that she's part machine. That's a sensitive subject to her. They then engaged their enemy within the library, using their spears to their advantage. But in the end, the Wedge Office was defeated. As for Philip, he ran away again, but didn't leave the library this time. He was bruised, bloodied, and beaten. It wasn't just his clothes that were torn apart. It was his mental state. He thought that he'd fight to the death this time, where he frustratingly asked, how much longer was he going to hide behind others, asking what could have changed if he stood with them. He lacks the courage to stand up to something. Honestly, how did he get to grade 5? Also, he hesitated when Salvador told him to run from the battle, which explained where the note came from. A backup plan. He believed that Salvador and Yuna wanted him to stay. But he listened to Salvador's last instructions, believing that it was for his sake. He saw himself as a hindrance there. So he went outside to get help from the Wedge Office. That he was believing that he was doing it for others, to sacrifice himself for others. It was then he realized his self-deceit. He saw how he just believed that he was a selfless man, that he kept running away, seeing himself as a vile and selfish person, using the Wedge Office, letting them die and running away again. He saw what he was doing as justifying his actions to himself. Philip, you aren't the first to say that it was for others. In fact, some use that as an excuse to commit atrocities and other cruel acts. Granted, that's a worst-case scenario, but it was then that Philip saw what Oscar saw in him, the most selfish and dangerous person. It was then he was honest about his intent, that he was doing that all for himself. This newfound honesty, along with a surge of emotion, brought about a change in him. Armed with this new power, with his searing sword and his feather shield, Philip understood that no one would cry on his behalf, even if he was sad. That sadness was his to bear. If he couldn't get rid of it, if he was trapped in a cycle of despair that threatened to drag him down, and then think of what comforted him, then he would embrace this sadness as part of the path of getting himself back on his feet. He gained a newfound sense of self-belief. He had to continue, as this was what his new power had given him the opportunity to do. But even with this power, it wasn't enough to defeat the librarians. but they couldn't finish him off. And this time, it wasn't because of cowardice. Roland could only comment on his gear where not even the workshops could make equipment as good as that. It reminded him of someone that he once knew. Angela recognized it as EGO, which wasn't someone's consciousness. Not exactly in this case. It's a physical manifestation of the mind, which to Roland sounded too vague to be real. Angela mentioned that it was L-Corp's singularity, but it was different. While L-Corp extracted EGO deliberately, Philip manifested his due to the white nights and dark days. Gebura suspected something like this happening, before Angela decided to say, "This, I'm writing my own script. I've been doing this current one for 1,000,000 years from my perspective, and I get nothing out of this. Why should I embrace oblivion? Just because my maker had that as the ending. I'm added to be continued to this." Yeah, that was the general feel that Angela had after going through all that in the Lobotomy Corporation. Roland was surprised that anyone can extract powerful equipment from their minds, free of charge. Roland, there is a price to that and a risk. Both aren't immediately clear. Angela then told him that she's never seen it manifest in this way. She then said that she was so curious, she shouldn't have let him get away. It wasn't because of Roland's carelessness. Well, at least not according to him, as it was because of something that Oscar likely slipped onto Philip. Likely some W-Corp tech. Well, they have teleportation technology. Angela then noted that Roland knew a few proficient fixers. Roland brushed that off as being hard not to run into seasoned veterans with mountains of experience, at least once as a fixer. Right. Are you sure it's not due to some other reason entirely? Next is something quite disturbing, even by my standards. And I am not easily disturbed or creeped out. Until next time. Hail the rabbit!